Tonight, a king's careless words will turn his closest friend into a saint, and his knights into murderers. Welcome back to Brutal History for Sleep, where history's darkest bedtime stories come with a gentle whisper. Thank you so much for supporting this quietly growing channel. Please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. Tonight, you'll hear how King Henry II's infamous outburst led 4 knights to hack Archbishop Thomas Becket to death at the altar. Drift off as we wander through cold cathedral stones, royal guilt, and the soft sound of sainthood being born from betrayal. You might think being King of England in 1170 would be a cushy job, lots of feasting, plenty of bowing subjects, and the occasional satisfying execution to keep things interesting. But you'd be wrong, because Henry II is having the medieval equivalent of the worst Monday morning meeting you've ever endured. Except this meeting has been going on for 6 years, and involves the fate of his immortal soul. Picture this: you're the most powerful man in Western Europe. You control more land than anyone since Charlemagne, stretching from the Scottish borders down to the Pyrenees, commanding armies that can crush rebellions and fleets that can blockade entire coastlines. Yet somehow your former drinking buddy has become your biggest professional headache. The kind of employee who makes you question every hiring decision you've ever made. Thomas Becket, once your loyal chancellor and party companion, the man who used to help you plot against rebellious barons over excellent wine and roasted venison, has transformed into the Archbishop of Canterbury and decided that God's rules trump your royal decrees. How wonderfully inconvenient for a king who thought appointing his best friend to run the English church would solve all his ecclesiastical problems forever. Thomas wasn't always this difficult. In fact, he used to be the perfect employee. Ambitious but loyal, clever but deferential. Someone who could handle delicate negotiations with foreign dignitaries while still appreciating a good joke and a better vintage. He was the kind of chancellor who made kingship seem effortless, handling the boring administrative details that keep kingdoms running. But then you made him Archbishop of Canterbury, thinking it would be brilliant to have your most trusted advisor running the church, and suddenly Thomas discovered religion with the enthusiasm of a medieval convert who's decided that hair shirts and fasting are more fashionable than silk robes and feast days. For 6 long years, you've watched your old friend evolve from a man who appreciated fine wine, political scheming, and the occasional hunting expedition into someone who wears hair shirts under his robes like a medieval performance artist, fasts so frequently he looks like a scarecrow, and has the unprecedented audacity to excommunicate your supporters when they dare to follow your perfectly reasonable royal commands. The transformation has been gradual but relentless, like watching someone you care about join a particularly strict religious cult that frowns on everything you enjoy about life. He has become the kind of person who cites canon law at dinner parties, who turns every conversation into a theological debate, and who somehow manages to make you feel guilty for exercising the power that God himself supposedly granted you. You've tried reasoning with him during increasingly awkward dinner parties, where the conversation dies every time someone mentions church politics, where the wine flows freely but the laughter comes forced. You've tried threatening him through intermediaries, because nothing says, "I value our friendship," like sending armed messengers with barely veiled warnings about the consequences of continued defiance. You've even tried that classic medieval diplomatic tool of sulking dramatically in various castles across your empire, moving your court from palace to palace like a royal teenager having an extended tantrum, hoping he'd notice your absence and come crawling back with apologies and wine. Nothing works. Becket keeps acting like his job description includes telling kings what they can and cannot do with their own churches. He's become the kind of employee who reads the fine print of every directive, questions every decision in meetings, and somehow makes you feel guilty for exercising the power that generations of your ancestors died to secure, and that you've spent your entire adult life learning to wield effectively. The specific issue that's driving you to distraction today involves the age-old question of who gets to punish misbehaving clergy, a seemingly simple administrative matter that has somehow evolved into a theological nightmare. Thomas insists that only church courts can try church officials, even when those officials commit crimes that would get ordinary people hanged, drawn and quartered without a second thought. You, quite reasonably, believe that criminals should face royal justice regardless of whether they happen to wear robes and mumble Latin for a living, because the idea that putting on ecclesiastical vestments provides immunity from earthly law seems like the kind of loophole that criminals will exploit faster than you can say benefit of clergy. And now, on this particular December day, in your castle at Borès in Normandy, the cold winter wind rattling the shutters like an omen of trouble to come, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a harsh winter, your frustration finally boils over into one of history's most consequential royal tantrums. The food sits untouched on your trencher, roasted capon that's probably delicious, fresh bread that's still warm from the ovens, winter pears preserved in honey that represent the kind of luxury that most of your subjects can only dream about because you're too angry to eat, too furious to sit still. What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought up in my household, you roar, your voice echoing off the stone walls and causing conversations to die mid-sentence as every man in the hall turns to stare at their king having what appears to be a complete breakdown. Who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric? The words hang in the air like incense at a funeral mass, except instead of blessing anyone or providing comfort to the grieving, they're about to curse everyone involved and set in motion a chain of events that will haunt English politics for centuries. Your face is red with rage, your fists clenched so tightly that your knuckles have gone white, and the fury in your voice carries the kind of royal authority that has toppled kingdoms. The hall falls into the kind of absolute silence that follows royal outbursts, broken only by the crackling of logs in the great fireplace and the distant sound of wind against the windows, while everyone present tries to process what they've just witnessed and calculate the safest possible response to their king's obvious distress. Some knights stare into their wine cups as if the answers to England's political problems might be written in the dregs. Others exchange meaningful glances that will later be interpreted as either wisdom or cowardice depending on how events unfold. It's the kind of moment that defines reigns and destroys friendships, and unfortunately for everyone involved, it's about to inspire the worst possible interpretation by the worst possible people. You know how sometimes you hear your boss complaining about someone at the office, and you think to yourself, someone really should do something about that problem, but then you remember you're a reasonable person with a mortgage and a basic understanding of human resources protocols. Well, imagine you're a medieval knight with a sword, a horse, several decades of military training, and absolutely no understanding of modern conflict resolution techniques. 4 of Henry's knights, Reginald Fitzurse, a man whose name literally means fierce bear and who has never met a problem he couldn't solve with violence. Hugh de Morville, who owns enough land in Cumberland to support a small army and has the ego to match, William de Tracy, whose family has been killing people for kings since before the Norman conquest, and Richard le Breton, a Breton nobleman who considers subtlety a form of cowardice. Exchange meaningful glances across their trenchers of roasted meat and ale. These aren't just any knights, they're household knights, men whose entire careers, social status and financial security depend on keeping their king happy and proving their loyalty through increasingly dramatic gestures of service. They've heard Henry complain about Becket before, during countless dinners, hunting trips, and late-night drinking sessions, but something about tonight's outburst feels different, more urgent, more actionable. The 4 men represent the cream of medieval military society, experienced warriors who've spent their adult lives following orders without question, fighting in campaigns across Henry's vast territories, and developing the kind of professional relationship with violence that makes them extraordinarily effective at solving problems that require sharp objects and complete disregard for their opponent's continued existence. Fitzurse has fought in Wales, crushing rebellions with systematic brutality. De Morville has served in Ireland, where he's learned that effective diplomacy often involves demonstrating what happens to people who resist royal authority. De Tracy has spent years in Normandy, defending Henry's continental territories, and Le Breton has campaigned in Brittany, perfecting the art of making political problems disappear permanently. Without a word passing between them, these 4 middle-aged warriors push back from the table, their heavy wooden chair legs scraping against the stone floor, with the kind of dramatic finality that suggests someone's about to make a very poor life choice that will echo through history textbooks for the next 8 centuries. The hall continues its festivities around them, Servants refilling cups with wine, dogs fighting over scraps of meat beneath the tables, younger knights arguing about tournaments and women. But our four heroes have entered that dangerous mental state where a king's emotional outburst transforms into a sacred mission, requiring immediate and violent resolution. They don't discuss their intentions, they don't ask for clarification from their obviously distraught monarch, and they certainly don't consider that maybe their king was just having a particularly stressful day managing an empire, and could have benefited from a nice cup of herbal tea, instead of vigilante justice delivered by sword-wielding middle management. Picture the scene. Four grown men in their 30s and 40s, seasoned warriors who've spent their careers following orders without question, suddenly deciding that regicide and regicide problem-solving is exactly what their professional resumes need to secure their places in their king's favour. They stride from the hall with the kind of purposeful determination usually reserved for crusades, calling for their horses with voices that carry across the courtyard like battle commands. Their squires scramble to prepare for departure, gathering weapons, packing supplies, and saddling destriers with the efficiency of men who've done this dance many times before, though usually for less morally ambiguous purposes than murdering archbishops. The four knights spend their preparation time checking their mail armour, sharpening their swords, and apparently never once stopping to think, hey, are we absolutely sure the king wanted us to actually kill Thomas Becket, or was he just having the medieval equivalent of a bad day at the office? No. They mount their horses and begin what will become the most ill-conceived business trip in English history. The English Channel crossing in December is exactly as miserable as you'd imagine. Cold, wet, and filled with the kind of seasickness that makes you question all your life choices, while simultaneously wondering if drowning might be preferable to whatever fresh hell awaits you on dry land. The crossing takes the better part of a day, during which our four heroes huddle together on the deck of a merchant vessel, wrapped in their cloaks and probably wondering why they didn't think to pack more blankets for their impromptu assassination vacation. The ship rocks violently in the winter swells, spray from the grey waves soaking everyone on board until they're all cold, wet and thoroughly miserable. But our determined quartet presses on, sustained by a combination of royal loyalty, professional pride and the kind of tunnel vision that prevents them from considering alternative interpretations of their king's emotional outburst. They spend the voyage complaining about the weather, arguing about the best route to Canterbury, and apparently never once discussing whether murdering an archbishop might have negative consequences. Once they reach the English coast, they ride through the muddy roads of Kent with the determination of men who've confused taking initiative with committing murder, their horses splashing through puddles and sliding on the winter muck, while they maintain the kind of grim focus usually reserved for military campaigns against foreign enemies. The December landscape is bleak and unwelcoming, bare trees reaching toward grey skies like skeletal fingers, fields lying fallow and brown under the weak winter sun, villages huddled against the cold with smoke rising from their chimneys in thin, desperate columns. It's the kind of weather that encourages reflection and careful consideration of one's life choices. But our four knights are far too committed to their interpretation of royal will to let a little atmospheric gloom dampen their enthusiasm for Archbishop murder. They spend their journey complaining about saddle sores, arguing about directions through a countryside that all looks the same in winter, and discussing the logistics of their mission with professional attention to detail. They plan their approach to Canterbury, debate the best time to confront Becket, and strategize about how to handle potential resistance from his household, all while never once pausing to consider that maybe, just maybe, they've misunderstood their assignment in the most catastrophic way possible. You'd think that after days of uncomfortable travel, sleeping in roadside inns that smell like unwashed bodies and spoiled ale, and having plenty of time to contemplate the political implications of their mission while their horses clip-clop through the English countryside, a moment's rational reflection might occur to our four knights. Perhaps a quiet, are we really about to murder God's representative in England, and have we considered the potential consequences for our immortal souls? But no, by the time they clatter into Canterbury on December 29th, their horses steaming in the cold air and their armour clanking with each step, they're committed to their interpretation of royal will with the kind of tunnel vision that would make modern middle management proud. The ancient city of Canterbury spreads before them like something from an illuminated manuscript. Narrow streets winding between timber-framed houses, the massive cathedral dominating the skyline like a stone giant reaching toward heaven, pilgrims and merchants bustling through the marketplace despite the winter cold. It's a place of holiness and commerce, learning and prayer, the kind of city that represents everything civilized about medieval England, which makes it particularly ironic that 4 knights are about to turn it into the site of an international incident that will make Canterbury famous for all the wrong reasons, while simultaneously ensuring its prosperity for centuries to come through the most macabre form of religious tourism ever devised. The irony of their situation would be amusing if it weren't so tragic. Here are 4 men who've spent their careers solving problems through violence, arriving at one of medieval Europe's most important centres of learning and spirituality, planning to resolve a theological dispute through the application of sharp metal to soft flesh. They've travelled hundreds of miles based on their creative interpretation of their king's emotional breakdown, spent their own money on transportation and accommodation, endured physical discomfort and seasonal weather, all to implement a solution that no one actually requested, and that will solve exactly none of the problems that inspired their mission in the first place. They find Becket not barricaded in some defensible castle surrounded by armed guards and siege engines, not hiding in a monastery surrounded by protective monks, but in his archbishop's palace, probably reviewing theological manuscripts and correspondence with the Pope, while wondering why everyone in England keeps looking at him like he's about to spontaneously combust into holy fire. The palace itself is a testament to ecclesiastical power. High stone walls, beautiful tapestries depicting biblical scenes, a library filled with priceless manuscripts, and enough wealth to make most kings envious, all of which serves to remind our 4 knights that they're about to confront someone whose authority supposedly comes directly from God himself. The confrontation begins with what passes for medieval diplomatic courtesy, which is to say it starts politely and descends rapidly into threats that would make modern diplomats reach for their panic buttons. The knights present themselves with the kind of formal bow that manages to be respectful and menacing simultaneously. They announce that they come on the king's business and demand that Becket accompany them to Winchester to answer to his royal master. It's the kind of polite request that comes with the unspoken addition of, "or else we'll make this everyone's problem," delivered with the sort of smile that doesn't reach the eyes and suggests that alternative options have already been considered and found wanting. Becket, to his credit, doesn't even pretend to consider their generous offer to travel across England in December to explain himself to a king who's already made his displeasure abundantly clear through 6 years of increasingly hostile correspondence. Dressed in his archbishop's robes and radiating the kind of moral certainty that makes compromise impossible, he delivers what amounts to a comprehensive theological lecture. You can almost see the knight's eyes glazing over as Becket explains with the patient tone of a teacher addressing particularly slow students why earthly kings cannot simply order around God's appointed representatives, why the Church must remain independent of secular authority, and why his loyalty to the Pope must supersede any earthly allegiance to even the most powerful monarch. It's like watching someone try to explain workplace harassment policies to a group of Vikings, technically correct, legally sound, and morally unassailable, but missing the immediate practical danger of being alone in a room with 4 armed men who've already travelled hundreds of miles specifically to solve this problem through violence. The knights exchange glances, the medieval equivalent of a group text saying, "Well, this isn't going according to plan, and our backup options all involve swords," while Becket continues his explanation of canon law with the kind of academic thoroughness that would be impressive in a university setting, but seems rather poorly timed given the current circumstances. They try once more, their voices taking on that strained politeness of people who are rapidly running out of peaceful options and beginning to remember why they brought weapons to this conversation. "My lord," says Fitzurse, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt, "the king's patience grows thin, and his anger burns hot. Surely you understand the wisdom of addressing his concerns before they grow beyond all remedy." It's the kind of diplomatic language that wraps threats in velvet, while making the underlying steel perfectly clear to anyone with basic survival instincts. When Becket remains unmoved, continuing to cite biblical precedents and papal decrees, with the serene confidence of a man who apparently believes that theological arguments provide adequate protection against sharp objects, they deliver the ultimate ultimatum: submit to the king's will and accompany them to Winchester, or face the consequences of continued defiance. Becket's response is essentially a theological middle finger, wrapped in Latin scholarship, and delivered with the kind of moral superiority that makes martyrdom seem preferable to compromise, which turns out to be an extraordinarily poor choice given the specific audience and circumstances. You know that moment in a workplace argument when someone storms out of the conference room and everyone thinks, well, at least that unpleasant conversation is over, and now we can all get back to our normal jobs? This is emphatically not one of those times. The knights don't storm out to cool off in the winter air, write a strongly worded report to their supervisor, or even retreat to the nearest tavern to drink away their frustration and plan a more diplomatic approach. Instead, they march outside to their horses with the kind of purposeful stride that suggests the negotiation phase of this encounter has officially ended and the violence phase is about to begin, much to the detriment of everyone involved and the future of church-state relations in England. Meanwhile, Becket, perhaps sensing that the afternoon's diplomatic efforts have reached an unproductive conclusion, makes his way from the palace to Canterbury Cathedral for Vespers, the evening prayers that mark the end of each day in the ecclesiastical calendar, apparently deciding that if he's going to face whatever comes next, he'd prefer to do it in God's house. The timing of Becket's movement to the cathedral reveals either remarkable spiritual insight or spectacularly poor strategic thinking, depending on your perspective on martyrdom as a career advancement strategy. On one hand, seeking sanctuary in a sacred space demonstrates understanding of medieval religious culture, where churches traditionally provided protection for anyone seeking refuge from secular justice. On the other hand, moving from a relatively private palace setting to a public cathedral during evening prayers ensures that whatever happens next will have maximum dramatic impact and the largest possible number of witnesses, transforming what might have been a quiet murder into a spectacular public martyrdom. The process of putting on medieval armour is not a quick affair. It involves layer upon layer of protection, from padded undergarments to chainmail hawks to metal plates, all of which must be carefully fitted and secured to provide maximum protection while still allowing for the kind of mobility necessary for effective combat. Watching four knights methodically arm themselves in an archbishop's courtyard has the surreal quality of a very specialised and threatening fashion show, except instead of preparing for a runway, they're preparing for murder, and, instead of impressing fashion critics, they're about to traumatise an entire cathedral full of monks and pilgrims. Fitzurse struggles with his male coif, cursing under his breath as the metal links catch on his hair. De Morville tests the weight of his sword, swinging it through the air with practiced motions. De Tracy adjusts his helm, the metal nose guard casting shadows across his face that make him look like death itself. And Le Breton checks his shield, running his fingers along the metal rim to ensure it's properly secured. The sound of metal rings clinking together fills the courtyard like church bells announcing the hour, except instead of calling people to prayer, it's announcing that four of England's most experienced killers are about to demonstrate their professional skills in God's house. When the knights discover that Becket has moved to the cathedral, they follow him there, now fully armed and bearing drawn swords that gleam dully in the weak winter light. They're no longer attempting diplomacy, negotiation, or even basic human conversation. They're four men who've committed so completely to misunderstanding their king's wishes that turning back would require admitting they've spent the last week planning to murder an archbishop for no good reason. The transition from the palace courtyard to the cathedral represents a shift from the secular to the sacred, from the political to the spiritual, from a space where violence might be understandable to a space where violence represents the most serious possible violation of both divine and human law. Canterbury Cathedral in 1170 is not just any church, it's the mother church of English Christianity, the seat of the Archbishop, and a place of pilgrimage that attracts visitors from across Europe seeking spiritual guidance, miraculous healing, and religious experience. It's a space designed for worship, contemplation, and prayer, where the architecture itself is meant to lift the soul toward heaven. The great cathedral doors echo with their heavy footsteps as they stride through the sacred space, their armour clanking against the stone pillars with all the subtlety of a construction project in a library during final exams. Monks and pilgrims flee before them like startled birds, some dropping their prayer books entirely to run for safety, others pressing themselves against the walls and crossing themselves frantically. So, the contrast between the knights' violent intentions and the peaceful purpose of their surroundings creates a scene of such profound inappropriateness that it seems designed by some cosmic sense of irony to demonstrate the absolute worst possible way to resolve a theological disagreement. You have to admire Becket's commitment to his principles, because when faced with 4 armed knights advancing on him through the sacred nave of his own cathedral, with drawn swords and expressions that suggest diplomacy is no longer on the agenda, he doesn't run for the nearest exit, doesn't hide behind the altar, doesn't even attempt to negotiate. Instead, he stands there, in his ecclesiastical robes, with the kind of stubborn dignity that's either incredibly brave or spectacularly stupid, depending on your perspective and your opinion of martyrdom as a career advancement strategy. He watches them approach with the calm expression of a man who's spent years preparing for this exact moment. The knights raise their swords with the practiced efficiency of men who've killed before and expect to kill again, their blades catching what little light filters through the cathedral's stained glass windows and throwing brief, colourful reflections across the stone walls like deadly rainbows. Becket raises his voice not in a plea for mercy or an offer of compromise, but in prayer, calling upon God to witness his suffering and to receive his soul into heaven, apparently convinced that martyrdom is preferable to submission and that dying for principle is better than living in compromise. The sound of steel against skull echoes through the cathedral's vaulted spaces, mixing with Becket's final prayers and the screams of fleeing monks and pilgrims in a chorus that definitely wasn't included in the original architectural plans when the building was designed as a place of peace and contemplation. What follows is less a fight than an execution, because Becket makes no attempt to defend himself beyond his prayers and his unwavering conviction that God will vindicate his suffering in the afterlife. The knights hack at him with their swords, each blow delivered with the kind of professional competence that comes from years of military training. The cathedral, designed as a centre of worship and pilgrimage, becomes an abattoir, where England's highest-ranking church official is butchered like a criminal, his blood pooling on floors where pilgrims and scholars have walked in peaceful contemplation for generations. Canterbury Cathedral's soaring arches seem to echo each blow, the stone witnesses to the most spectacular violation of sanctuary in English history, while somewhere in Normandy, Henry II continues his dinner, blissfully unaware that his afternoon tantrum has just created a martyrdom that will outlast his dynasty. Picture this. You've just committed what is arguably the most career-limiting move in medieval history, something that makes previous workplace disasters look like minor scheduling conflicts by comparison. You're standing in a pool of blood, in England's most sacred cathedral, your swords dripping onto stone floors that have been consecrated for centuries. And you're slowly realising that maybe your boss was just having a bad day, rather than issuing actual murder orders. The 4 knights stand there, breathing heavily from their exertions, their armour spattered with blood, and their faces bearing the kind of expression that suggests the adrenaline is beginning to wear off, and rational thought is starting to creep back into their consciousness, like unwelcome house guests arriving at the worst possible moment. The remaining monks and clergy stare in the kind of shocked silence usually reserved for natural disasters, tax audits, and other manifestations of divine wrath, their faces pale with horror and their hands trembling as they attempt to process what they've just witnessed in what should have been a place of sanctuary and peace. The immediate aftermath of the murder creates a tableau that would be almost comedic if it weren't so tragic. 4 heavily armed men standing over the body of an archbishop in a cathedral during evening prayers, suddenly realizing that they may have made a slight error in judgment that will have consequences extending far beyond their original intentions. It's like watching a group of soldiers who've just conquered a city only to discover that they attacked the wrong country, or a team of auditors who've just shut down a business only to realize they were looking at the wrong set of books, except with more religious implications and significantly higher stakes for everyone involved. The only sounds echoing through the vast cathedral space are the distant echoes of fleeing footsteps as word spreads through Canterbury like wildfire that the Archbishop has been murdered, the occasional drip of blood hitting ancient stone with the regular rhythm of a water clock marking time, and the heavy breathing of 4 men who are beginning to realize they may have slightly misinterpreted their assignment. The cathedral, moments before filled with the peaceful sounds of evening prayers and contemplation, now resembles the aftermath of a particularly enthusiastic battle, except battles usually take place on designated battlefields rather than in God's house, and they typically don't result in international incidents that threaten the stability of kingdoms. Monks who haven't already fled peer around pillars and through doorways like frightened mice, crossing themselves frantically and whispering prayers that seem inadequate to address the enormity of what has just occurred in their sacred space, their faces reflecting a combination of terror, disbelief, and the kind of spiritual confusion that emerges when violence invades a place specifically dedicated to peace. You'd think this might be an appropriate time for some quiet reflection on the nature of loyalty, the importance of clear communication in professional relationships, and perhaps the wisdom of asking clarifying questions before committing felonies that will echo through history textbooks for the next millennium. Instead, our four heroes experience what can only be described as the medieval equivalent of a collective "oh shit" moment, a sudden and overwhelming realization that their interpretation of royal will may have been overly enthusiastic, and that the consequences of their actions are likely to be both immediate and severe. They look at each other with the kind of desperate eye contact that passes for group communication in crisis situations. They look at the body of the man who was, until very recently, one of the most powerful figures in English society, and they look at the horrified faces of the witnesses, who will undoubtedly be sharing this story with anyone who will listen for the rest of their natural lives. The dawning horror of their situation settles over them like a cold fog, bringing with it the realization that they've just committed the kind of act that starts wars, topples governments, and gets people excommunicated, exiled, or executed, depending on the political winds and the availability of suitable scapegoats. They reach the kind of rapid consensus that only comes from shared panic, and the mutual recognition that staying in Canterbury any longer than absolutely necessary would be the second worst decision they could make today, after the first worst decision of murdering an archbishop based on their boss's emotional outburst. Time to leave becomes the unanimous and immediate priority, implemented with the kind of military efficiency that would be admirable under different circumstances, but now seems like closing the barn door after the horses have not only fled, but have also burned down the barn and started an international incident. They flee Canterbury like students escaping detention, except students usually don't leave behind dead archbishops and traumatized witnesses, mounting their horses with hands that shake from more than just the December cold, and riding away from the city with the kind of desperate speed usually reserved for retreating armies. The horses' hooves thunder against the cobblestones as they race through Canterbury's narrow streets, past houses where families are gathered around their hearth fires, past taverns where people are enjoying their evening ale, past shops and churches and all the normal activities of a medieval city that's about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. Behind them, they leave not just a body, but the kind of international incident that keeps diplomats busy for decades, provides material for chroniclers for centuries, and creates the sort of political crisis that makes kings question their hiring practices and their anger management techniques. The news of Becket's death will spread faster than they can ride, carried by messengers and merchants, pilgrims and priests, until it reaches every court in Europe and every monastery from Scotland to Spain, transforming four relatively unknown knights into the most wanted men in Christendom. Meanwhile, back in Normandy, Henry II is probably enjoying the remainder of his evening meal, perhaps sampling some excellent wine from his extensive cellars, discussing matters of state with his advisors, or simply relaxing by the fire with a good book, blissfully unaware that his afternoon tantrum has just created the most problematic employee review in European history. He might be wondering why his knights haven't returned yet, perhaps assuming they're taking their time to ensure that his message to Becket is delivered with appropriate gravity and diplomatic consideration. The irony is delicious in its completeness. While Henry sits in his warm hall, four of his most loyal retainers are racing through the English countryside like fugitives. You know how sometimes the worst possible outcome of a situation becomes the best possible outcome for someone else? Like when a terrible employee gets fired and immediately lands a better job that makes everyone question the judgment of their former employer. Thomas Becket is about to have the most successful posthumous career change in medieval history. He's transforming from a troublesome archbishop who couldn't get along with his king into the most popular saint in England and one of medieval Europe's most effective tourist attractions, proving that sometimes the best way to win an argument is to let your opponent kill you and then spend eternity being vindicated by popular opinion and divine intervention. Within hours of his death, word spreads across England and the continent like the most efficient marketing campaign ever devised, except instead of selling products, it's selling the concept of martyrdom and the political implications of murdering God's representatives in their own cathedrals. The story grows with each telling, picking up dramatic details and theological significance like a snowball rolling downhill through a particularly fertile landscape of medieval superstition and political opportunism. Except, instead of snow, it's accumulating miracle stories, political implications, and enough religious fervour to power a small crusade. The transformation of news into legend happens with remarkable speed in medieval society, where information travels through networks of monasteries, royal courts and merchant guilds that connect communities across vast distances, and where stories are currency, as valuable as gold or silver. Monks copy the story into their chronicles, adding theological commentary that explains the spiritual significance of what's happened. Royal courts receive the news with varying degrees of horror and delight, depending on their current relationship with Henry II. Merchants carry the story along trade routes, sharing it in taverns and marketplaces. Pilgrims begin arriving at Canterbury before Becket's blood has even been properly cleaned from the cathedral stones, drawn by a combination of genuine religious devotion, morbid curiosity, and the medieval equivalent of disaster tourism that makes people travel hundreds of miles to see the sites of famous tragedies. They kneel where he fell, pressing their faces to the cold stone and praying for intercessions from England's newest unofficial saint, while enterprising local merchants begin selling small bottles of water mixed with drops of the martyred Archbishop's blood, pieces of cloth that may or may not have touched his robes, and other religious souvenirs. The cathedral, which had been merely important before, suddenly becomes the most significant pilgrimage destination in northern Europe, with visitors arriving from France, Germany, Italy, and even the Holy Land itself, all eager to pray at the site where an archbishop died for his principles. The economic transformation of Canterbury from regional religious centre to international pilgrimage destination happens with breathtaking speed, demonstrating the medieval world's remarkable ability to monetize tragedy and transform political disasters into profitable tourist attractions. Local innkeepers find themselves booked solid for months in advance as pilgrims arrive, seeking lodging near the cathedral. Merchants discover that anything even tangentially related to Becket's martyrdom can be sold at premium prices to visitors eager to take home physical reminders of their spiritual journey. Henry II, meanwhile, is discovering that having your employees commit murder without explicit orders is even worse than having them ignore your instructions entirely, like finding out that your well-meaning assistant has burned down the office building while trying to fix the thermostat, except with more international implications. The news reaches him through a series of increasingly frantic messengers, each bearing reports that seem too catastrophic to be true. First, that Becket is dead, then that he was murdered by Henry's own knights, finally that the entire Christian world is holding Henry personally responsible for the death of God's representative in England. The Pope is furious, writing letters that practically burst into flames when opened, demanding explanations that Henry cannot provide without admitting that his kingdom's foreign policy is apparently being conducted by knights who mistake royal tantrums for military orders. The French king is absolutely delighted by the diplomatic opportunity, welcoming English exiles with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for unexpected windfalls, while every kingdom in Europe suddenly looks at Henry like he's that colleague who replies all to company emails with inappropriate comments. The international reaction is swift and universally negative, like a medieval Twitter storm conducted through official diplomatic channels and church hierarchies. Bishops across Europe condemn the murder in terms that make Henry's previous political problems seem like minor administrative difficulties by comparison. The Pope threatens interdict, which would essentially shut down all religious services in England and make Henry's subjects question whether their king's policies are worth eternal damnation. Trade partners begin reconsidering their commercial relationships with a kingdom whose foreign policy apparently includes murdering religious leaders without provocation. Henry finds himself doing public penance, with the kind of theatrical humility that medieval politics demanded in crisis situations, walking barefoot to Canterbury, through the cold English countryside like a common pilgrim, his royal feet bleeding on the stones as he approaches the scene of his political disaster. The sight of the King of England, ruler of territories stretching from Scotland to Spain, humbling himself before the tomb of the man his knights killed, is the kind of political theatre that medieval chroniclers live for, and modern historians struggle to adequately describe. Monks line the route to Canterbury Cathedral, and Henry allows them to whip him while he prays at Becket's tomb, submitting to physical punishment with the kind of public contrition that's supposed to demonstrate royal remorse, but mostly succeeds in making everyone wonder how a king who can conquer territories can't manage to communicate clearly with his own household staff. The four knights, meanwhile, are experiencing the medieval equivalent of being permanently blacklisted from every decent job in their industry, realizing that we were just following orders isn't going to work when nobody actually gave those orders, and the consequences include international incidents and papal condemnation. Fitzurse, de Morvel, de Tracy, and Le Breton discover that killing an archbishop provides excellent name recognition, but terrible career prospects, as every court in Europe suddenly becomes unavailable to men whose resumes include murdered God's representative based on creative interpretation of royal frustration. They flee to Rome to beg the Pope for forgiveness, undertaking the kind of penitential journey that involves walking hundreds of miles while contemplating the difference between loyal service and catastrophic misunderstanding, spending the rest of their lives in exile, and presumably wondering how a simple desire to please their boss led to becoming the most wanted men in Christendom. Their journey to Rome becomes its own kind of pilgrimage, except instead of seeking blessings or miracles, they're seeking absolution for what may be the most spectacular misinterpretation of management directives in medieval history. Along the way, they're recognized in towns and villages across Europe, pointed at and whispered about like celebrity criminals. The Pope eventually grants them forgiveness, but with conditions that essentially amount to permanent exile and a lifetime of penance that makes their original mission seem like a pleasant vacation by comparison. And Thomas Becket? He gets the last laugh by becoming more powerful dead than he ever was alive, his tomb becoming one of medieval Europe's most popular pilgrimage destinations, and his story inspiring centuries of literature, art, and the occasional Broadway musical. Canterbury Cathedral transforms from an important but regional religious centre into an international destination that attracts visitors from across the known world, generating enough tourism revenue to rebuild the cathedral in increasingly elaborate styles and fund religious artwork that depicts Becket's martyrdom with artistic grandeur. The miracles begin almost immediately, because nothing attracts pilgrims quite like reports of divine intervention at accessible locations with adequate lodging and reasonably priced food vendors. Sick pilgrims report sudden recoveries after praying at Becket's tomb. Blind visitors claim restored sight, and deaf petitioners insist their hearing has returned. The cathedral clergy carefully document each reported miracle, creating an extensive archive of divine interventions that will provide material for hagiographers and tourist brochures for centuries to come. Within 3 years, Pope Alexander III canonizes Thomas Becket as a saint, making official what popular opinion had already decided, and transforming the murdered archbishop into Saint Thomas Becket, miracle worker and martyr supreme, whose feast day will be celebrated across Europe. The canonization process moves with unprecedented speed, suggesting that even the Vatican recognized the promotional value of a saint whose story combines political intrigue, royal conflict, and the kind of dramatic death scene that medieval audiences found irresistibly compelling. The cult of St. Thomas spreads across Europe with the efficiency of a well-organized franchise operation, with churches dedicated to his memory appearing in locations from Norway to Sicily, each claiming some connection to his story and offering their own locally produced miracles. His story becomes a standard feature of medieval literature, inspiring poems, plays, chronicles, and artistic depictions that ensure his martyrdom will be remembered long after the political circumstances that caused it have been forgotten by everyone except professional historians. Canterbury itself becomes medieval England's most successful tourist destination, attracting visitors who spend money on lodging, food, souvenirs, and religious services, with the kind of economic impact that makes local merchants pray for more martyred archbishops, though presumably not enough to actually encourage additional ecclesiastical murders. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the eternal lesson of Thomas Becket's story. Clear communication is important in any workplace, especially when dealing with employees who have access to weapons and horses. Violence is never the appropriate solution to management disagreements, no matter how frustrated your boss appears to be. And sometimes the best revenge is becoming a saint and making your enemies walk barefoot through the mud to apologize to your dead body. The four knights thought they were solving their king's problem through decisive action and loyal service, but instead they created a martyrdom that outlasted kingdoms, a tourist destination that survived the Reformation, and a cautionary tale about the importance of asking, "Are you absolutely certain that's what you want us to do?" before drawing your sword in a cathedral. Henry II's reputation never fully recovered from the association with Becket's murder, despite his public penance and apparent genuine remorse for the unintended consequences of his royal tantrum. The incident became a defining moment of his reign, overshadowing his considerable achievements in law, administration, and territorial expansion. The story serves as a permanent reminder that kings, like modern executives, need to be careful about expressing frustration in front of subordinates who might interpret complaints as actionable directives requiring immediate and permanent solutions. The broader implications of Becket's murder echo through English history for centuries, influencing the relationship between church and state, the development of English law, and the evolution of constitutional monarchy that will eventually limit royal power and establish the principle that even kings must operate within legal and moral boundaries. Sweet dreams, and may your own workplace conflicts never involve quite so much bloodshed, international incident, or posthumous canonization. Sleep well, good night, and remember, tomorrow's problems probably don't require medieval solutions, and if your boss seems frustrated with a colleague, perhaps suggest mediation rather than assassination as a conflict resolution strategy. After all, human resources departments exist for a reason, and that reason is to prevent the kind of catastrophic misunderstanding that turns royal frustration into martyrdom and transforms workplace disputes into international incidents that last for centuries and inspire countless retellings by sleepy historians who appreciate the darkly comic aspects of medieval management failures. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.